Now, Indian political scientists as a group do not like Narendra Modi. As a result, it is not surprising that India ranks 105th in the world on the VDEM rankings. India's democracy is ranked on a par with those of the Ivory Coast, where the incumbent president won with 95% of the vote at the last election after exiling his chief opponent. India is on a par with Thailand, a sometimes constitutional monarchy that has suffered 20 military coups in its democratic history. It's rated on the same level as Iraq. I won't say more.
As you're all aware, Australia and India have long had a lot in common. We're both democratic, market-oriented, English-speaking, born of the same mother, if you like, and dedicated to the rule of law. We also both face the common threat of Islamic fundamentalism and an increasingly assertive China in our region. Remember, India has fought border wars with China, and it's increasingly seen in Washington as the most natural anchor for a US partnership in the Indo-Pacific region. However, and that brings us to tonight's discussion, and particularly the Q&A session, India's commitment to democracy, secularism, freedom of the press, human rights, has been increasingly questioned during the past decade, which is to say during the era of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Indeed, the democratic standing for India has been downgraded in recent years. According to Freedom House, this is the prominent New York-based foreign policy human rights think tank, India is only, quote, partly free. And according to the Economist Intelligence Unit, India is home to, quote, a flawed democracy. So the issues this evening are, will Modi's supremacy, and remember, Prime Minister Modi has won 3 elections on the trot. He's currently serving a 3rd term as Prime Minister. Will Modi's supremacy hinder India's rise, as a headline of a US-based Foreign Affairs magazine article asked? Is the state further curtailing the rights and freedoms of citizens, especially its huge Muslim population? And is India a worthy ally in the campaign to hedge and balance against an increasingly assertive China? Well, we at CIS are thrilled to launch the book this evening of our former colleague, Salvatore Babones. He's a professor of sociology at the University of Sydney. He's author of several important publications, including The New Authoritarianism, Trump Populism and the Tyranny of Experts, which the Wall Street Journal praised as one of the most noteworthy books in 2018, most noteworthy political books in 2018. He's also author of a major CIS publication that we published in early 2020, just on the cusp of the COVID lockdowns. And the book, or the publication, was on the extent to which Australia is dependent on China with respect to not just minerals, but also agriculture and higher education. That CIS paper was called The China Student Boom and the Risks It Poses to Australian Universities. And it was our most widely quoted publication in the international press in our near 50 years of history here at CIS. Extraordinary interest in Salvatore's paper. It tells you the significance of the paper that he published. Salvatore is also author of a new book, which we're launching. It's called Dharma Democracy, How India Built the Third World's First Democracy. And that's published by our friends at Connor Court in Brisbane. And the book essentially questions the strength of the data, the evidence, and the neutrality of the people who conduct the surveys about India's human rights and democratic record. Please join me in welcoming Salvatore Babones.
Thank you, Tom. I'm American, not Australian, and I didn't know that Australia was born of Bharat Mata, the Mother India. But if you share a mother, that must be it. It is often said that India is the world's largest democracy. Much more interesting is the fact that India is the world's poorest well-institutionalized democracy, with a history of open and competitive elections going all the way back to 1951. In the foundational work of quantitative comparative democracy, the political scientist Adam Przeworski concluded that, statistically speaking, quote, the odds against democracy in India were extremely high. That conclusion was based primarily on India's GDP per capita, which has only recently risen above the average for the African continent. To put India's GDP into perspective, some other poor countries that are now recognized as hosting successful democracies include Costa Rica, which is 7 times as rich as India, Botswana and Jamaica, each roughly 3 times the GDP per capita of India, or even questionable democracies like South Africa and Indonesia have roughly double the GDP per capita of India. India is by far the world's poorest democratic success story. Okay. Yet none of these developing countries, even the ones that are 5 or 10 times as rich as India, can match India's record of 74 years of democratic constitutional governance. The closest India ever came to faltering was during the 22-month emergency of 1975 to 1977, a dark period of repression that was nonetheless characterized by civilian rule in accordance with constitutional procedures. What's more, the emergency ended with an election in which the incumbent, Indira Gandhi, was peacefully ejected from office, and she accepted the verdict of the voters without complaint. She even lost her own seat and accepted the outcome. Which leads me to the purpose of this book, to understand how India built the third world's first democracy, both first in time. It was the first founded, the first post-colonial country of the wave of decolonization after World War II, and in many ways, I would say in most ways, first in quality. In other words, why did India succeed where so many others failed? Nearly all post-colonial countries started out as democracies or with the ambition to be democracies. The real question isn't why India chose to be a democracy. Everybody chose to be a democracy. The real question is why India remained a democracy even after its lapse into emergency rule half a century ago. How did Indian democracy survive when so many other democracies failed? India succeeded for the same reason that our Western democracies have succeeded, because India's nation builders established a well-knit, horizontally integrated civil society that was capable of supporting democratic institutions even during periods of adversity and conflict. As the political scientist Robert Putnam put it, such, quote, networks of civic engagement that cut across social cleavages nourish wider cooperation in society. Much like Australia in an earlier era, India is a nation of associations and societies, and has been since the late 19th century. India wasn't saved from dictatorship by its brilliant constitution. Lots of countries that slid into dictatorship have brilliant constitutions. It wasn't saved by its glorious freedom fighters. Many countries have glorious records of resistance against colonial rules and nonetheless descend immediately into dictatorship upon independence. And India was not saved by its legacy of British colonialism. I hear that explanation all the time, yet all you have to do is look at India's neighbors. Pakistan shared all the institutions of British colonialism in South Asia. Sri Lanka benefited from probably much more benign colonialism and a higher level of income than India. Myanmar was carved out of British India in the 1930s, again, sharing many of the same institutions. And we could go all across, whether it's Malaysia or Africa, look at former British colonies around the world. The only ones that were born as democracies and remain democracies are a few rich Caribbean territories that made a seamless transition in the 1970s or 1980s from colonial rule to democracy. All of the British colonies that fought freedom struggles and gained independence in the 1950s, 60s, early 70s, all of those countries at one point or another slid into dictatorship or military rule. So if India followed the same trajectory as our Western democracies of building a democracy based on a strong, well-knit civil society, why haven't Western political scientists noticed? They seem to have missed out on the Indian story because they were too caught up in the standard story of the West, of the development of democracy in their own countries. The standard story of democracy in the West is that a rising middle class formed horizontal civil society organizations that connected people across all classes and creeds to form the foundation on which a stable democracy could be built. To quote the political scientist Barrington Moore, "A vigorous and independent class of town dwellers has been an indispensable element in the growth of parliamentary democracy. No bourgeoisie, no democracy." And yet, where was the bourgeoisie in India in 1947? Noticeably absent. Indeed, the rise of the middle class was the reason why civil society emerged in the West. But India's middle class is small even today, and 50 years ago it was minuscule. India did not go the route of developing a civil society through its middle class. India developed a civil society without, or maybe we should say before, developing a middle class. It had the same causal mechanism as we see in the West, but it did not follow the same historical trajectory. In India, completely missed by Western social scientists, a nationwide civil society was built mainly by Hindu religious and social reform movements. From the second half of the 19th century, reformers like Dayananda Saraswati, who's familiar as the founder of the Arya Samaj reformist sect, Debendranath Tagore, who was active in developing the Brahmo Samaj, again Hindu reform sect, into a nationwide movement. Most famously, Swami Vivekananda, who founded the Ramakrishna Mission and the Vedanta Societies, which you can find even here in New South Wales. They sought to unify Hindu society across caste and sectarian lines. They were creating horizontal linkages that connected Hindu civil society without regard to caste or particular Hindu sect. They wanted to unite all Hindus in a single society. They were later joined by the more explicitly nationalist organizations like the Hindu Mahasabha of Vinayak Savarkar and the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the National Volunteer Organization, founded by K.B. Hedgewar in 1925, that counts among its volunteers the current Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi. Organizations like these fly under the radar of Western political science because they are thoroughly suffused with religion. And in the West, civil society originated in opposition to organized religion, not in cooperation with it. But as Kipling wrote, "East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet." That fundamental misunderstanding of the East, of not realizing that religion in the East was different from the Christian religions of the West, prevented Western political scientists from seeing a civil society that was sitting in plain sight. They ignored it completely. In the Christian West, religions place people in vertical silos, dividing society into separate communities. The very timing of religious observance reinforces this tendency. Even in countries that enjoy complete religious freedom, nearly all churches hold their services on Sunday morning, and the public chooses which among the options to attend. One does not hop from the 9 a.m. Anglican service to the 10 a.m. Catholic Mass to the 11th a.m. Methodist meeting. You're born in your church and you die in your church. And you create connections, at least as far as you create religious connections, you create them within your church. Not so in the Hindu faith. If you go to a Krishna temple, you will also find Rama and his helpmate Hanuman, as well as Shiva and Parvati, along with their popular son Ganesh. A family that is particularly devoted to Shiva will also celebrate the birth of Lord Ram and the spring holy festival commemorating the marriage of Radha and Krishna. People can and do visit any temple at any time, any day of the week. What we call Hinduism, more properly called Sanatan Dharma, or eternal duty, does not divide Indians in vertical silos. It unites them in horizontal linkages that support a strong civil society. Thus the title of the book, Dharma Democracy. There is, however, one group that stands largely aloof from India's Hindu civil society, the 200 million strong population of Muslim Indians. That creates the key challenge of Indian democracy, the relative exclusion of roughly 15% of the population from the national mainstream. The social exclusion of Muslim Indians doesn't stop India from being a democracy. After all, no one seriously doubts that the United States was a democracy in the 1950s, despite much more serious exclusion of African Americans from the political community at that time. The United States of the 1950s was a racially exclusionary democracy. It was not an autocracy or a dictatorship or an authoritarian regime. It was a democracy with a race problem. Similarly, India today is a democracy with a religion problem. And if 1950s was a democracy with a race problem, 2020's India is even more a real democracy. Unlike African Americans in times past, Muslim Indians have always enjoyed full civil rights. Their income levels are roughly similar to those of the majority population. They have absolute freedom of religion, and they report relatively low levels of overt discrimination. The minority problem in India isn't the American problem of separate but unequal rights. It's a problem of equal but nonetheless separate public spheres. Muslim Indians largely keep to themselves, and my impression from 5 years of research is that most Hindu Indians, even relatively liberal, thoroughly westernized Hindu Indians, are perfectly happy with that arrangement. This is the great challenge to the future of Indian democracy. Interestingly, however, this one great challenge to Indian democracy does not figure anywhere in the international democracy indices. Democracy indices and the resulting headlines have savaged India in recent years, as have related indices of freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and others. But none of these, not even the freedom of religion indices, have downgraded India based on the social exclusion of Muslim Indians. In fact, they have not downgraded India based on any objective data at all. Instead, they have been unwitting and sometimes witting tools of domestic Indian politics. For the international rankings are not, in fact, international. They are international platforms that merely recycle domestic Indian complaints against Narendra Modi. Now, if you know anything about international politics other than Donald Trump, you know that India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi is a polarizing figure. Adored to the point of worship by his greatest fans, he is absolutely loathed by his enemies, loathed and widely vilified. Modi leads India, however, as the head of a coalition government in which his alliance won only 43% of the vote at the last general election and governs only 21 of India's 36 states and union territories. Nonetheless, he is routinely characterized in academic and journalistic circles as an authoritarian or even a fascist dictator. Part of this is due to his overt religious traditionalism, which is anathema to the English-speaking intellectual elite of India. Part of it is due to the fact that he has unseated the Indian National Congress as the natural party of government and patronage for the first time in 100 years. And part of it is no doubt due to the snobbery over his humble origins as a so-called backwards caste Gujarati tea seller who got his education from correspondence schools instead of from one of Delhi's elite colleges. Whatever its causes, Modi derangement syndrome is real, and it seems to drive most or all of the international disparagement of Indian democracy. There are, in fact, three major indices that rank substantially all of the world's countries on the quality of their democracies. Let me run you through them. The oldest is the Polity Index, produced by a small group of American political scientists loosely connected with the University of Maryland. It rates countries on a scale from -10, full autocracy, to +10, consolidated democracy, based on a limited number of clear, bright-line indicators that include the holding of competitive elections and the existence of institutional constraints on executive power. Polity, which has been around now for more than, 60 years, rates Indian democracy at a 9 on a scale from -10 to +10. 1 point below Australia's perfect 10, and 1 point above the flawed 8 of the United States and United Kingdom. The newest democracy index, however, is the Varieties of Democracy Institute, or VDEM index. VDEM rates countries on a mix of objective and subjective criteria covering the extent of the franchise, the proportion of officials who are elected, the quality of elections, freedom of expression, and freedom of association. On the objective indicators in VDEM, nearly every country gets a perfect score. Even the Chinese Constitution provides for universal suffrage, and it gets a perfect score for suffrage. In Vietnam, all officials are elected. It gets a perfect score for elected officials, even though they're elected on ballots that include only one candidate to vote for. As a result, nearly all of the discriminant power in the VDEM indices come from subjective expert evaluations of things like the independence of electoral commissions, the degree of academic freedom, or the influence of government over the press. These are fundamental unknowables. We can't know how independent the Electoral Commission is. We can have an opinion on it, but nobody actually knows except those on the commission. We can't really know how free the academy is. We can all have an opinion on it, but we can't easily verify that opinion. Is the government secretly influencing the press, a metric that India scores particularly badly on? Well, if it's secretly influencing the press, by its very nature, that is secret, and we don't know about it. What's worse, for VDEM, these evaluations come not from international expert review panels. They come from in-country political scientists. That is to say, the VDEM rankings are not really an international ranking. They're really, at least as far as India is concerned, an Indian ranking. Now, Indian political scientists as a group do not like Narendra Modi. As a result, it is not surprising that India ranks 105th in the world on the VDEM rankings, one spot below Singapore, another academically disfavored country. India's democracy is ranked on a par with those of the Ivory Coast, where the incumbent president won with 95% of the vote at the last election after exiling his chief opponent. India is on a par with Thailand, a sometimes constitutional monarchy that has suffered 20 military coups in its democratic history. It's rated on the same level as Iraq. I won't say more. Okay, all of this is based on the subjective views of India's own political scientists, not on an independent external evaluation by Western analysts looking at objective data. The weaponization of international rankings by intellectuals within a country raises an interesting epistemological point. Epistemology is the study of how we know what we know. For example, let's leave India aside for a moment. How do we know that New Zealand is among the best countries in the world for freedom of the press, while Australia languishes in 29th place, and Australia was in 39th place under the coalition? We know because the Press Freedom Index, published by Reporters Sans Frontières, or Reporters Without Borders, tells us so. It's the only index we have. How does RSF know that New Zealand is among the best countries of the world for freedom of the press? It polls its members. And who in Australia is likely to be a member of Reporters Sans Frontières? I'd be willing to bet that not a single journalist at the Daily Telegraph or Sky News is a member of Reporters Sans Frontières. On the other hand, I'd also wager that at the ABC, our tax money pays for journalists' professional association memberships in Reporters Sans Frontières. The result is that Australia is dinged by RSF because, quote, press freedom is not constitutionally guaranteed, but a hyper-concentration of the media combined with occasional pressure from the authorities on media professionals endanger public interest journalism. Meanwhile, in New Zealand, a country where press freedom is not constitutionally guaranteed, there is only one daily newspaper and one state-owned television news channel. Yet New Zealand is rated among the best in the world. It works the same way with democracy rankings. Had the VDEM rankings not been funded in 2015, we would not now know that India has a flawed democracy. VDEM actually calls Modi's India an electoral autocracy. But absent VDEM, we would all think all we would know is that India rates a 9 out of 10 on the polity scale. In other words, I would not have written this book and we would not be here discussing it if VDEM had not been created in 2015 to re-rank the world's democracies based on subjective criteria. Okay, India gets top marks from the Disinterested Polity Index, but is ranked among the worst countries that actually hold election by VDEM. How does it score in the other ranking? Well, the last of the three major democracy rankings is the Economist Intelligence Unit. They put India in 41st place in the world, just below most Eastern European countries. The Economist rankings are done by the staff of The Economist based on no formal methodology. It's just what they think. India's Economist ranking has been declining in recent years, in fact, ever since the VDEM rankings were first published in 2017. Have the staff at The Economist been influenced by India's highly publicized slide on the VDEM rankings? It seems likely. That's epistemology. My own view, formed after 5 years of intensive research into Indian democracy, is that Indian democracy does very well. Whether India is a 9 out of 10 or somewhere on a par with the poorer countries of the European Union, I can't say. Either view is credible and can be supported by data, depending on what you mean by democracy. It's the difference between India as a full democracy that faces some challenges due to poverty, or the alternative, India as a flawed democracy because many people are too poor to fully participate. This is what social scientists call thin versus thick conceptions of democracy, with a strong moral implication that the thick conceptions of democracy are the only real democracy. I tend to differ. If we throw all of our favorite social causes into defining democracy, then what's left to be not democracy? For example, if a democracy suspends elections in an area under insurgent attack, is it a non-democracy or a flawed democracy? Or is it a democracy that's facing an internal security challenge? I prefer the latter characterization because it gives us more to analyze as social scientists. We can now analyze the relationship between democracy and internal security challenges. But if internal security challenges are subsumed under the definition of democracy, I can't easily study the relationship between the two. Nonetheless, I want to emphasize either characterization is methodologically perfectly valid. However you cut and slice the data, India is among the world's great democracies and a beacon for the developing world. If the other countries of the developing world could raise themselves to India's standards, the world would be quite democratic indeed. For the last 75 years, we have thought of the free world as fundamentally falling along the Atlantic axis of North America and Western Europe, with a few isolated Pacific outposts fringing the massive continent of Asia. As India increasingly identifies with the democratic West, that axis of freedom is turning into a global network of freedom. It would be a shame if we let India's aggrieved intellectuals convince us that India does not belong to the free world. It would be even more of a shame if we listened to our own anti-Western intellectuals who want to sabotage any further cooperation between India and the West. Whether you love or loathe India's current Prime Minister or have no opinion at all about Mr. Modi, India is a free and democratic country. We should all rejoice at that. And we should all support India's increasing integration with Australia and the rest of the free world. Thank you.
Now, we at CIS, as I'm sure many of you know, one of our intellectual heroes is John Stuart Mill, and he famously said, "He who knows," this is the 19th century British liberal, "he who knows only his own side of the argument knows little of that." And that's been our motto at CIS for much of our 50 years. So with that in mind, I thought I'd take this opportunity to put to Salvatore the arguments that his critics would make and get his response before we take your questions on a wide range of issues. It doesn't have to be related to Indian democracy and human rights. It can also be related to foreign policy, which is a big issue now in the face of a rising China. So with that, let me start with the International New York Times. This was just a few weeks ago. The headline was, "India's Muslims fear a growing backlash after the Kashmir attack." Now, this was in response to the April...
The Pahalgam massacre.
Exactly. Yes. So this was, and this was in April of this year. And the New York Times say state officials have detained thousands of Muslims and demolished homes. And activists say that right-wing Hindus are intensifying a demonisation campaign. And the Times goes on to say widespread detentions and demolitions of property targeting Muslims in India have provoked concerns that right-wing Hindu nationalists are exploiting April's terror attack in Kashmir to deepen a campaign of oppression against the country's largest minority group. That doesn't sound like a vibrant liberal democracy, Salvatore.
No, it sounds terrible. And it's exactly the sort of writing we see in venues like the New York Times. It conflates multiple issues together. So those of you who are following the news, there was a horrific terrorist attack at Pahalgam in Indian Kashmir. The expected response, it was a Pakistan-sponsored attack. The U.S. government has now endorsed that view, that it was a Pakistan-sponsored attack. The main purpose of the attack, from the Pakistan perspective, would have been to divide India along religious lines. That is, to provoke a Hindu response against Muslim Indians because of the attack. The attackers explicitly killed only Hindu Indians. And in fact, even one Hindu Nepali was killed for being Hindu. They even went so far as to, forgive me, I know this is a family venue, have men drop their pants and check for circumcision and make them, okay, so it was a horrific, religiously divisive attack, and the expectation was there would be a big backlash in India. There was a modest backlash in India. There were one or two cases, highly publicized, of hostility towards Muslim neighbors among Hindu Indians, as you would expect to happen. There was no widespread violence. There were no pogroms. There were no burnings of houses. Now, what the article mentions, homes have been bulldozed in India, homes of people who have engaged in violent crime or religiously motivated attacks. However, the Supreme Court has now declared that illegal. Those are past demolitions. Those were not as a result of the Pahalgam attacks. Similarly, many people were detained as a result of the attacks.
Well, the Times goes on to say that Mr. Modi's party, the BJP, has long employed demonisation of Muslims to reunite India's Hindu majority. And in the days after the attack, Kashmiri students studying the cities around India reported harassment and threats.
No, certainly there are tensions between Hindus and Muslims in India. And the whole purpose of the attacks was to provoke such a response. The fantastic thing is there was not such a widespread response. Now, what this article is doing is citing a litany of claims from the past 5 years and rolling them into the supposed response to the Pahalgam attacks. That's why I mentioned the bulldozings. The bulldozings were clearly wrong. They were illegal, as the Indian Supreme Court has now endorsed. They weren't specifically bulldozing of Muslim homes, but there were bulldozing of homes of criminals. But that was not in response to the Pahalgam attacks. Okay. And that has now been, I'll just say, India's democratic institutions have properly worked to put an end to this improper administration of justice.
Okay, you talk about institutions. What about the judiciary? This is Ramachandra Guha, a distinguished Indian intellectual
very prominent
New York-based Foreign Affairs magazine published by the Council on Foreign Relations, the most distinguished foreign policy think tank arguably in the world. He says, sadly, the Supreme Court of India has done little to stem attacks on democratic freedoms. Now, in the past decades, he argues, the court had at least occasionally stood up for personal freedoms and for the rights of the provinces, acting as a modest brake on the arbitrary exercise of state power. But since Modi took over in 2014, he argues, the Supreme Court has often given its tacit approval to the government's misconduct by, for example, failing to strike down punitive laws that clearly violate the Indian Constitution. And he concludes, one such law is the Unlawful Activities, this is the Prevention Act, under which it is almost impossible to get bail and which has been invoked to arrest and designate as terrorists, in inverted commas, hundreds of students and human rights activists for protesting peacefully on the streets against the majoritarian policies of the regime. How would you respond to Professor Guha?
Historians often have very little historical memory. So the UAPA was in fact promulgated under a previous Congress government. It was used more often quantitatively. And so what I do in the book, in Dharma Democracy, is go through the data on questions like this. The UAPA was actually used more often by the previous Congress government than it has been used by the current BJP government. The Supreme Court of India is among the most independent in the world. So we could all accuse the Supreme Court of being biased against our side. But the fact is the Indian Supreme Court is self-perpetuating. The Indian government plays virtually no role in the appointment of Supreme Court justices. Instead, there's a college of justices who appoint their future colleagues. It's all based on seniority within the system. And no one would accuse India's higher judiciary of being BJP infused. In fact, this is among the most secular, most English-speaking, most elite non-BJP organizations in the country. So the fact that an independent Supreme Court endorses something the BJP does doesn't mean that the Supreme Court is no longer independent. It just means that you don't like the outcome.
What about journalism in India? Has that become a dangerous occupation in India?
So again, we have data on this. We hear that more journalists have been killed in India than in any country outside China over the last 10 years. But of course, there are more journalists in India than any country outside China. When we standardize this for the size of the population, journalists in India are safer than journalists in the United States. They're safer than journalists in the rest of the developed world. They're only more endangered than journalists in Western Europe and Australia.
The World Press Freedom Index, that's published annually by Reporters Without Borders, India ranks 161 out of 180 countries.
Worse than Hong Kong.
This is the Washington Post. In the past few months, 2 foreign journalists, one a bureau chief. Remember, I'm just challenging him just to keep the conversation lively. I'm not endorsing this criticism, so please don't and ah. And go, ooh, isn't Switzer being provocative? I'm just doing our job at CIS.
It's the job.
This is the Washington Post.
I did the same several years ago to Tony Abbott on the occasion of India's 75th
and we had a great event with Tony. Exactly. Now, in the past few months, this is the Washington Post, 2 foreign journalists, one a bureau chief with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, one a French reporter who had lived in India for 23 years, had their credentials revoked or blocked for renewal and left the country after the government criticised their work. Now, they interviewed at the Washington Post N. Ram, a veteran journalist and former editor-in-chief of The Hindu. The Post says it's one of the most respected publications in India. And he makes the point, this is N. Ram, quote, I looked at the Committee to Protect Journalists database. The number of journalists killed in connection with their work in India In the decade this government has been in power, 19 have been killed.
Well, I've already addressed that.
I know, but
when it comes to
but he makes a more telling point. Even worse, India figures in the Global Impunity Index. Journalists are killed in connection with their work, targeted and murdered. Those who cover corruption, crime, politics, human rights, and there is impunity for the killers.
So, first, we have to standardize for population size. 19 people out of a population of 1,400 million, 1.4 billion is really not that many. Second, if you drill down into the Committee to Protect Journalists data, you find the reasons why people were killed. Overwhelmingly, they were not killed by the government. They were not killed by police. They were killed caught up in gangland wars. They were covering terrorism and were killed in terrorist attacks. The most gruesome are people who were covering corruption among gangsters, and they were killed by gangsters and their associates. Well, does India have a mild law and order problem? For a country with a GDP per capita of $2,500 a year, India is a paradise of law and order. That is, if you were to imagine the situation in most African countries, Africa has a similar level of GDP to India, the safety situation is far, far worse. Now, as far as ejecting journalists the government doesn't like, that's a problem. I don't want to say that India is all sweetness and light. However, I'll point out that Australia denies visas to visiting speakers who the government doesn't agree with. Yeah. Well, if it can be done in Australia, and Australia is still a democracy, it can be done in India.
I think then Ram's point is that it's got worse under Modi over the last 10 years.
So that's simply not supported by the data. Yeah. That is, when you go to the data and you look at the equivalent 10-year periods, we see in all of, and these are detailed in the book, in all of these major quantitative indices, essentially no change between the previous Congress government and the current BJP government. Now, I don't endorse any restrictions on freedom of speech, whatever. What I do as a comparative social scientist is try to benchmark. If we all accept that Australia is a democracy, despite the fact that Australian governments prohibit speakers it doesn't like from speaking in Australia on grounds of public disturbance or will cause a ruckus, well, I don't like that. I'm very against that. But democracies do this.
Let me just conclude my round here by just referring to the global indices that you've talked about. And I started my introduction with, I think it was
Freedom House. Yeah,
Freedom House.
That's right. Because it's not really a democracy index, but I'm happy to talk to Freedom House.
Well, let's get to that. And this is from the Hindu Online. VD Institute's recent democracy index, which is it has termed India, quote, one of the worst autocratizers, it's an ugly word, autocratizers. India had already ceased to be a democracy on this index in 2018. Similar indices have downgraded India's democratic standings in recent years. And I mentioned the Freedom House one, but they also talk about the, I think it's the Economist Intelligence Unit, Flawed Democracy. They say India is better classified as, quote, an electoral autocracy. Your response to that general wave of criticism of India?
Right. The Rise of Democracy Institute actually rated India as a full democracy, a liberal democracy in 2018. But then after Narendra Modi won the 2019 election, they decided they had it wrong. And they went back and recharacterized India as an autocracy. Now, part of that process was the democracy rating industry needs a problem in order to get funding. If you look at the titles of reports, they run down the gamut from, democracy at midnight, autocratization continues, the death of democracy, ? And you have to provoke a sense of fear in order to generate funding. VDEM chose to reclassify India as an autocracy and then chose to weight its index of autocracy by population, which it doesn't do for other things, in order to create the impression that more than half of the world lived under autocracies, was their big headline. Because if you combine China and India and throw in Russia and a few others, then you get a world of autocracies, but only if you weight by population. So India was crucial to their need to have a global emergency of democracy. and they got it. Now, the problems with Freedom House indices are much more technical, and they have to do with problems with mostly with not standardizing for population. So a lot of the questions on Freedom House ask, has anyone ever been detained unlawfully? Or has anyone ever, and they're framed in, has a person been? In India, of course, is a huge country. There are irregularities, there are miscarriages of justice, and they are well reported in the Indian press, which is a vibrant, free press. And so we know about them. Was somebody detained illegally in Madagascar? I have no idea. It doesn't make it into the English language press.
Okay, now it's time for our Q&A session. And our first question comes from Peter Curdy, my colleague there at the back. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Tom. Your opening remarks about India's age and stability as a democracy. Given India's experience as the world's largest democracy, what democratic innovations or institutional safeguards has India developed that Australia and other established democracies might learn from in addressing contemporary challenges like polarization or populism?
That's a much more difficult question than what I thought you would ask about. I thought I was going to get the status of Christians in India, and that's an easy one. They do very well. I'm not sure what Australia can learn. I can tell you what other developing countries can learn. What developing countries can learn is that the key to a successful democracy is having a unified nation, having people feel that they are all part of a single national community. And that's a very Durkheimian conception of democracy. It comes from the sociology of Emile Durkheim, the idea that the nation has to exist to be democratic. Now, in Australia, there's a democratic nation, and it goes back from well before federation. However, there are people in Australia who would like to see Australia become two nations or multiple nations, to think of Australia as a truly multicultural community instead of as a single unitary community. And that would be potentially destructive to Australian democracy if democracy were really to start to fragment along identity lines in Australia. Now, I think that's been much overplayed. I don't think Australian democracy has fragmented or will fragment along identity lines. But what has broken up most developing country democracies has been that one ethnicity wins the election and the other ethnicity isn't willing to accept the result. And that's the end of democracy.
Next question from Richard Beattie there at the back. G'day, Richard.
G'day, Tom. And Salvatore, thanks very much, because that was such a fascinating presentation that you gave. My question is, getting back to J.S. Mill, the idea was that you are open to understanding two sides of a story. Much of what you've talked about this evening has been the failure of Western academics, intellectuals, to actually do what Mill said was essential for democracy. The question, why?
We tend to be very self-indulgent as academics. We can study what we want. We have serious academic freedom. Regardless of what you may have heard, academic freedom is alive and well in Australia. Nobody tries to block my work, and nobody tries to block the work of my colleagues. However, it does allow us to become really very self-indulgent and to take our own politics into our research. It's very rare for social science academics to treat the outside world, the external world, objectively. And I think one of the strengths I've brought to the study of Indian democracy is that I have no stake in India. I didn't set out on this research project to prove that Indian democracy was successful. I didn't set out on this research project to validate Narendra Modi or the BJP. I simply set out on a research project with no preconceptions and no stake in the outcome. And I think, unfortunately, most, not all, not the overwhelming majority, but maybe 2/3 of social science academics are strongly and proudly invested in the outcomes of their research, so much so that they characterize themselves in many cases as scholar activists. My chief targets in this book are South Asian scholars who actually have formed a South Asian Studies Scholar Activist Collective. And they sought to prevent publication of this book. They sought to get me fired from the University of Sydney, saying that I was endangering the lives of South Asia studies scholars by questioning their work because Narendra Modi's Hindu mob was going to come burn down their houses because I criticized them. That's what we deal with in social science academia. It's unfortunate, but that's how it works.
Now we've got time for another question. Yes, sir. G'day.
Evening, Salvatore. Terrific address. Thank you very much. My question is in two parts. Number one, what would your evaluation be of India's foreign policy under the Modi administration? And number two, where do you see the future of India's relations with Australia with a lens on economics, i.e. trade and defence? Thank you.
The story of Indian foreign policy has been one of continuity. There's a nearly perfect straight line from the foreign policies of the previous government to this government. It's tilting towards the West, towards greater engagement with the United States and other Western countries. But there's a broad consensus on foreign policy in India. It may not show up in the headlines, but it shows up in the actions. And after the Pahalgam attacks, groups of parliamentarians from multiple parties, including opposition parties, went abroad to tell India's story about the Pahalgam attacks. So I think there's a lot of continuity, and I don't think that anyone in the West should be worried that if there's a change in government in India, it would result in a change in India's trajectory. I think India's trajectory is really baked in to never be an explicit ally of the United States or other Western countries, but to always be increasingly oriented towards the United States and other Western countries. For Australia, there's nothing but goodwill in India, except when it comes to cricket. And in general, Australia has always spoken of highly in India. It's viewed as a fellow democracy with which India shares a lot of history, despite my little jab at Tom at the beginning. And like I said, nothing but goodwill. I think it's an open door.
But just following on from the foreign policy issue, there's a growing consensus in Washington, and Professor John Mearsheimer, who's spoken here on a few occasions, has made the point that America will go to great lengths to form a balancing coalition of states against China, because China's seen as a rising power that threatens the status quo in our region. But of course, India is not a natural balancer. It's not part of an alliance. It's long seen itself as independent, part of the non-aligned movement. So to what extent do you think India, either under Modi or his successor, will move increasingly closer to Uncle Sam as a way of balancing against the rise of China?
From the Indian perspective, substantial portions of Indian territory are currently occupied by China. There's no border agreement between the two, and it's unlikely that there will be any time in the foreseeable future. India has gone much farther than Western countries to battle Chinese totalitarianism. India's, for that matter, banned most Chinese apps. You can't do TikTok in India. Now, whether that's right or wrong is for a liberal to debate, but it's certainly not pro-China. The India's beef with China has very little to do with the West, and it is not going to counter China at the behest of Uncle Sam or anybody else. It's going to pursue its own independent foreign policy, which, thankfully, from an Australian or an American perspective, aligns very closely with American
when John
priorities.
Bolton, the former Trump National Security Advisor, spoke at our keynote event in 2022, he was very frustrated. He was asked about this by the host, Sam Grant. He was very frustrated that India was increasingly cozy with both Iran and Russia. And that complicated America's efforts to hedge against China.
Yeah, India has no real conflict with Iran or Russia. In fact, I'd say that it's beneficial for the United States, Australia, and the broader West that India does maintain these relationships. I mean, just look at the fact, how did Nixon get to China? He went through Pakistan. Now, if Pakistan had not maintained a connection with China, there would have been no U.S.-China rapprochement in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s.
Rory Robinson's one of our banking sector's most prominent economists. Rory.
Our former prominent economist. Thanks, Tom. Retired for 2 weeks, played golf every day for the past 14 and won't stop till it rains. Salvatore, thanks very much for your talk and congratulations on your book. I've sort of been a lightweight on India, but I like cricket and care about cricket. And I've been saying off the top of my head for most of the past decade that maybe the IPL, which is basically 10 teams battling every night and twice on Sundays for about 6 weeks. I've been saying that might be the greatest force for unity in India, in India's short history. Does that sound about right? And you were saying earlier that unity is really powerful for democracy and helping democracy. Is cricket part of all that?
I know nothing about cricket. So I really can't comment much on that. But it's certainly good for India's integration with Australia, given I understand that a large number of Australians play in the IPL. Is that correct? So that's good news for Australia, but really, Lord Robertson, no comment.
Next question, Rafe Champion, one of our long-time members at CIS. G'day, Rafe.
Look, I've got a question both for you and for the speaker. I just want to know how on earth you managed to overlook cricket amongst the features that unify or are common to India and Australia. I think that was a preposterous overlook. And that leads immediately to the next thing. We note that, we find that Indira Gandhi left the crease, as it were, when she was dismissed by the electorate. Well, one of the most enduring traditions in cricket is obeying the umpire's decision. So to that extent, cricket is clearly a fundamental part of the durability of democracy in India.
Again, I'll just use the opportunity to say that I'm not an India expert. I'm not an Indologist. What makes this book special is it's the first book on Indian democracy written by a comparative social scientist, not by an India expert or by someone who presumes that he or she is an expert on India merely by virtue of birth in India. There are a whole slew of books on the end of Indian democracy written by Indians and non-resident Indians. There are a whole slew of books about how awful Indian democracy is written by experts on India. What I'm doing in this book is benchmarking India. We all have complaints about our democracies. I mean, look at a few years ago, Scott Morrison signed himself into 5 different ministries. If I wanted to say Australian democracy is threatened, I could easily point to that and say he was an autocrat in the making, a potential dictator, using the COVID crisis to enhance his personal power and stay in office forever. But no Australian would buy that. Why? Because, we benchmark Australia. We know Australia compared to other countries is pretty similar. We're comfortable with it. Americans didn't bat an eye over Scott Morrison signing himself into multiple offices. No one minds that Australian politicians have been caught taking cash from Chinese donors. Again, these are minor problems that happen everywhere. As a comparativist, you look across. One of my the sections I'm proudest of in the book is a section on academic freedom, where instead of looking at complaints about academic freedom, I look into the exact numbers of academics who've been dismissed from their jobs for political reasons. I identify all the cases in India, and I'm confident I've found them because, believe me, there are people in India who want to complain about academic freedom. They're easy to identify. And then compare to the number in Australia, UK, and New Zealand, and find that there are more people in the last 5 years, more academics who've been dismissed on political grounds in our Western democracies than in all of India. Well, that kind of benchmarking is what I bring. No, I'm not an expert on cricket. I don't know India. I don't speak Indian languages. I am not an Indologist. I'm a comparativist who's trying to benchmark India to countries that we all know are democracies.
Okay, next question. And we'll go to you afterwards. Yeah.
Hi there. Thanks very much for the talk. If I understood correctly, you referred to limitations on the rise of democracy thanks to the lack of bourgeoisie or the limits on bourgeoisie. If that's the case, was the lack of bourgeoisie after 47 thanks to the departure of the British, or was it in 1857 thanks to the end of the Mughals?
Look, India, and Indians don't like to hear this. India has always been a poor country by today's standards. Of course, India was relatively wealthy compared to other countries in the world 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, but that's hardly the issue. There was never an industrial revolution leading to the creation of a mass middle class in India before 1947. In fact, that's only happening now in the last 20 or 30 years. What Western political scientists have missed is that although although civil society organizations arose out of the middle class bourgeoisie in the West, that's not the only place they can come from. And they weren't looking for a civil society coming from somewhere else. And they certainly weren't looking for a civil society arising out of religious organizations, because in the West, religion was always a barrier to civil society that had to be overcome, not something that promoted the formation of a denser civil society, as happened in India.
Next question. Thank you.
Hi, good evening, Salvatore. Thank you for that lovely and very enriching talk. I'm just curious about the title that you've chosen. What does Dharma mean to you when you talk about Dharma Democracy? How did that come about?
I follow Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan. Dharma is duty. It's that simple. And India has a democracy of duties. In fact, when Indira Gandhi, during the emergency, put a charter of duties in the Indian constitution, although most of her changes to the constitution were reversed after 1977, that charter of duties remained. It was not controversial in India. Now, other countries that have charters of duties are generally non-democracies. The Soviet Union had a charter of duties. Lots of totalitarian regimes talk about duties. India is the one unambiguous democracy that has a language of duty. And the reason I chose the word dharma is that it means both duty and, of course, the Hindu faith. That is Sanatan Dharma, eternal Dharma is the Hindu faith. And I think that Indian democracy really has survived and matured because of the connection with the Hindu faith. On the other hand, that has sowed the seeds of the chief challenge to Indian democracy, the status of non-Hindus in India, which is a serious challenge that has to be addressed if India is to prosper and grow in the future.
Okay, next question, and then we'll go to you.
Hello, my name is Daniel. Thank you so much for your address tonight. Australia's security seems tied up with India through things like the Quad. Our economy is deeply entwined through things like education exports and trade. I'm wondering, if you were advising the Prime Minister on his agenda for the term ahead, how would you advise him to continue strengthening our ties with India over the coming term?
Thank you. I have a conflict of interest in answering that question because I've been very critical of the government's policies on Indian students in Australia, which has been largely to view them as a low-wage labor force. So I think the India-Australia connection today, economically, is driven mostly by, I'm going to be frank, low-wage labor exported from India to Australia, combined with high-skill diaspora professionals exported from India to Australia. It's almost entirely a human connection. There's a very thin line of Australian exports to India or imports from India, and there is a massive untapped opportunity for Australian investment in India, particularly through super funds and family offices, that is patient investment that can invest in India for the long term. Australia is tragically underinvested in India. When you compare Australia's investment in India as a percentage of outbound foreign investment, or you view it in per capita terms compared to the US and Europe, Australia simply has not seized the opportunity represented by India, despite being so close geographically and having such a broad human connection of Indians in Australia who could facilitate that flow.
Next question.
Thank you for the talk. For someone who's spent a lot of time in India, both for work and travel and for sport, just thank you for bringing attention to India. You've debunked some of the views on democracy in India. I wonder if you could push that further on corruption in India. Whenever people talk about India, they talk about the systemic corruption at a federal, even a state level and a local level. I'm curious, although you're not an Indiologist, I'm just curious in your research for this or your other travels, is that fair? Is it not fair? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse?
It's certainly getting better, and that's due to the move to transparent electronic processes in India. Now, ironically, some of the complaints against Indian democracy arise from filing requirements that have been placed on foreign organizations making donations in India. They have rebelled against the idea that they should have to file these electronically and provide the national ID numbers of the people receiving the donations. And so India has been hit on freedom of association in the VDEM rankings precisely because it's been fighting corruption. That said, there's certainly corruption in India. There's corruption in all countries. The trajectory seems to be in the correct direction. Also, I remind everyone that India over and over again, I remind you, India has a GDP per capita on a par with that of the African continent. Its GDP per capita is substantially lower than Indonesia's. So if we were to compare, is India doing well on corruption comparing to Indonesia, or Papua New Guinea is even richer than India? Certainly, Malaysia and Thailand are incredibly richer than India, 4 or 5 times as rich as India. Is India corrupt compared to those countries? Well, probably not very corrupt compared to those countries. So the fact that India, at a much lower level of GDP per capita, is achieving such strides against corruption is really something very promising.
We have time for one more question, but before you might want to get the mic across. Before we get to that, the issue of, I think Rafe mentioned the issue of cricket. And of course, illiberalism goes beyond India. Many of us liberals in Australia and indeed the Western world has lamented the rise of what's called cancel culture in the Western world and this illiberal mindset. And a few years ago, and I wrote about this in the Australian newspaper at the height of the COVID crisis, I talked about the absurdity of that illiberal mindset. And I referred to a group of British academics, and I'm reading this. They declared that cricket had become one of the most exploitive features of the British Empire. And I thought when I read this report by these British academics, and this is what I said, never mind that one of the most valuable businesses in modern India is the Indian Premier League franchise worth more than $5.5 billion to the mostly Indian people who own it. That doesn't sound like exploitation, does it?
Was cricket the most exploited or most exported? I wasn't sure you got,
it's
the
definitely
word right.
exportable, but anyway. Next question.
Thank you for that. Look, it was very enlightening, very different to what I came here thinking that this would be about. I'm of Indian origin. I travel back home a lot. What I hear over there is totally in contrast to what you've just said. So I'm just curious about the source of your research. You said you don't have interest in India. You did this because of your academic interest. So my question is, what was the source of your research, basically? Because from what I understand, you can't trust any data that comes out of that country because of how because of the gatekeeping, basically. So data in is data out. So I hope you haven't relied on just that. Just curious to know how you formed your opinion about.
So first, let's start with democracy in general and complaints about it. All of you are keen observers of the U.S. political landscape. How many of you have heard anything good about U.S. democracy in the last 8 years? Nothing good about U.S. democracy. From both sides. I mean, Biden was a dictator. Trump was a Nazi. I mean, we've heard nothing but how completely corrupted American democracy has become. And yet, when it comes to indices, we all accept that the U.S. is a democratic country. We may roll our eyes and dislike what we see in America, choose your side, but we all accept that it's a democratic country. Now, Indians similarly come to me with complaints. Does that mean that India is not a democratic country? Or does that mean that India is a vibrant democracy where everybody's unhappy and complaining about the status of democracy? Now, the difference is when an American complains about the status of American democracy, an Australian reporter who's been to America, may have done a stint with a U.S. paper, is very conversant with U.S. politics. When an American complains to that Australian, democracy's dead in America, the Australian reporter does not take that for granted and write it up in an article that America is now a dictatorship. However, when it comes to India, the Indian goes to the Australian reporter, says, democracy's dead in India. Since I left, these terrible things have happened. And the reporter doesn't know any better. And so they think, well, India, poor, forgive me, brown country in the global south. Yeah, the complaints are probably right. India's probably a dictatorship, like all those other third world dictatorships. Okay, so what I've tried to do is completely ignore every qualitative claim I've heard and try to go as much as possible to history and data, to go to original sources. I've found that probably 60% of the details I find in Indian histories, standard Indian histories, are either inaccurate, wrongly cited, or politically motivated. The reason the book's taken so long, a full 5 years of research, is that unlike what I would normally do as a sociologist, I've had to go to primary sources for almost everything down to, did Gandhi really say this? Often he didn't, and you have to go look and find it. So I've tried to verify every single fact. When it comes to the data, I'm not just looking at the numbers, I'm trying to benchmark verifiable numbers against what the claims are. So if there is a data point that India ranks 160 on the Press Freedom Index, okay, great. What is that based on? And we try to go down to the building blocks. So if the accusation is that India has no freedom of the press because the press has no variety and no viewpoint diversity, it's entirely controlled. Well, then I start reading the Indian press, and we try to figure out, okay, was it good for democracy that the Adani business empire bought NDTV, which was a regime-critical TV channel? No, that's not a positive for democracy. Is that the end of freedom of the press? Well, clearly not, because there are many venues in which people are critical of the government. And what I try to do is benchmark to countries that we all accept are democracies. And if India's media diversity is similar to that, not just of Australia, similar to that of the United States, well, yeah, even though you may not like the media or like what it says, that's clearly not undemocratic. And we do that on metric after metric after metric. And that's what the book's all about. 2 chapters of the book are going through the metrics and trying to determine, where does India stand, not in absolute terms. Everyone has complaints in absolute terms. Where does India stand benchmarked to other countries that we all accept are democracies? And on that metric, India does very well.
Salvatore, thank you. And thanks all of you for being here this evening. Now, since Salvatore came to Australia, what year was that?
2008.
You've distinguished yourself as a prominent player in international affairs, sociology, of which you're a professor at the University of Sydney.
Associate professor.
Associate professor, sure. I get these right at universities. And you've been a major figure on China policy debate. I didn't even mention Salvatore is one of the few Australian-based academics who's been published in the aforementioned Foreign Affairs magazine, and he wrote a piece on China policy, I think in 2011.
2011, yes.
Yeah. And now he's distinguished himself as something of a contrarian thinker on India, but one voice that needs to be heard in the current debate. And on behalf of my colleagues at CIS and all of you here, thank you so much for being here. Salvatore Babones. For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.